Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Elizabeth Barrett Browning. But there's been so much conversation here that we've had about being married or unmarried and what the laws were in regard to it. I thought I'd show another Catherine Maria Sedgwick book. It's right on the topic, married or single. Why was Maria writing about married or single? It's like asking why Saturday Night Live producers were looking for a sitcom named Married or Single. Did they go back into antebellum America to find it? That's what we're trying to do here. Why Poe is kind of stuck up about Aurora Lee, I don't know. I think the English are kind of stuck up. That's my opinion. So anyway, we're just going to read a little bit of chapter 4 here. Aurora Lee is made up of three number of ingredients held together by the creative furia of the author. The poem is a self-confident bravura performance, and it is the performance itself rather than any single ingredient that is the most striking feature. Aurora Lee unscrupulously mixes genres, novel, autobiography, social satire, tract for the times, treatise on poetics, theocracy, subjects, geography ranging from the slums of London to the New Jerusalem, and themes sexual, vocational, aesthetic, social, religious, and holds them all suspended in a cornucopium fluency of discourse that makes use of the hyperlote tame. An early admirer of the poem, described as a system of notation created from instant to instant out of anything and everything. This description nicely captures the breathless hit or miss feel of the narration, which can quickly modulate from the dialogue to the description of some chromatic sequence of the fine thought, leading to the unconjectured harmony. There are many examples in the poem that Virginia Woolf called the lively and secular and satirical play of Barrett Browning's mind. Her ardor and abundance, her brilliant deceptive powers, her shrewd and caustic humor, a superb one-line example of Aurora's description of her early unauthentic poems as gasp of make-believe galvanic life, a more prototechnic notation of the description of the soul as not a clean white paper, but a palimpsest of prophets' holograph, defiled, erased by coverts by a monk's, the apocalypse by a longus pouring on, which obscene text may be discerned perhaps some fair fine trace of what was written once, some unspoken of an alpha and omega expressing the old scripture. The worldly and the satirical aspects of the poem, its Don Juan elements, also are influenced by the account of the conventional education of the young lady that Aurora's aunt imposes in her book 1 and highly society gossip of St. James Church in book 4, the extended rendering of Lord Howe's Evening Party, book 5, and the splendid characterizations of upper-class personages of the ostensibly Catholic Sir Blaise de la More, 35, and medieval Lord Howe and notional radical whose socialist ideals do not keep him from living according to the aristocratic traditions of the kind, and best of all, the worldly Lady Waldemar, who is every bit Aurora's equal in intelligence, satiric bite, and scintillating figurative language. Some of early readers of Aurora Lee were extravagant in their admiration. John Ruskin, for example, hailed it as the first perfect poetical expression of the age, and told Robert Browning, I like it all, familiar parts, unfamiliar, passionate and satirical, evil telling and good telling, philosophical and dramatic all. And at the end of the century, Swinburne still vividly remembered the poem's initial impact. The advent of Aurora Lee can never be forgotten by any lover of poetry who was old enough at the time to read it. They were right in the impression that they never had read anything in any way comparable to the unique work of audaciously feminine and ambitiously impulsive genius. It is one of the longest poems in the world, and there is not a deadline in it. The response to other readers, however, was more equivocal. Some judged the poem immortal and unfit for perusal because of the references to prostitution and because of the story of Maria Airy, who was drugged, raped, and impregnated, but nevertheless remains essentially pure and a loving mother of the illegitimate child. Baring Browning's response to such criticism was as unflinching as it is commendable. I don't like coarse subjects of the coarse treatment of any subject, but I am deeply convinced that the corruption of our society requires not shut doors and windows, but light and air. That is exactly because pure and prosperous women choose to ignore vice that miserable women suffer wrong by it everywhere. Another example of her humanitarian concern is the depiction of the London proletariat, the slum called St. Margaret's Court, the appalling denizens of St. Giles, the work in the seamstress shop, including Lucy Gresham, who dies squalidly in the bed she shares with her demented and paralytic grandmother. In the end of The Princess, Tennyson's narrator remarks the ourselves, we English are full of social wrong, but one would never have guessed to this to be the case from anything that went before in his poem. The London of Aurora Leigh, on the other hand, comprehends the London of Engels, the condition of the working class in England, Dickens' Bleak House, and Mayhew's London Labor and the London Poor. The periodical reviews of Aurora Leigh, including appreciable amounts of negative criticism. Some of it was directed at the two principals, non-title characters, Romney Lee and Marion Earle, who were condemned as implausible creations, puppet-like embodiments of ideas and ideal values lacking distinctive voices. It is easy to understand these structures. Both Romney and Marion have character, but neither has personality. The former lives by diagrams and crosses out the spontaneities of all these individuals' personal life with former individuals. The latter is self-effacing and without ego, as colorless as her physical appearance, not white nor brown, but could look like either, like a mist that changed according to being shown, no more or less. But both are thematically vital to the poem and essentially features its representation of the age. The major complaints of reviewers concern the poem's style and formlessness. The first of these was the target of W.C. Roscoe's Anima Visions of the National Review. Barrett Browning, he wrote, had the habit of poetizing everything and the maintaining of artificial heat for his purpose, but he programmatically poetic excitement tended to manifest itself only in the poem's diction, and there was no corresponding elevation in the structure of the meter or the flow of the rhythm. Moreover, there was frequently a discordance between matter and manner, for example, between a subject and a similar under which what was represented. Baron Browning frequently made the error of carrying a figurative comparison one step too far, and when Aurora is describing the annotations of her father's book, and so on, in the Leaguer's scholar's regal way, to giving judgment on the parts of speech as if he sat on all 12 thrones up piled, arranging Israel. The single word regal, Roscoe observed, was all that was needed. The last two lines were de trop. These complaints are largely justified. Stylistic excesses can be an impediment to the reader's engagement with Aurora Leigh. Through not everyone will agree that they compromise a fundamental deficiency. Roscoe's phrase or a passage on the prince describing a mechanics institute fete, Tennyson's remark that it was very difficult in blank verse to give descriptions and at the same time to remain poetical elevation, and that the employment of rhyme would have made it much easier. Where Tennyson is calculating and qualitative, Barrett Browning is impetuous and quantitative. A great deal of the blank verse of Aurora Leigh is distinctly prosy and only nominally metrical. The author seems to have had felt that elevation could be achieved simply by the addition of an endless stream of figurative ornamentation. The most sympathetic way to regard this applique is to place it in the context of Barrett Browning's extraordinary, energetic, and resourceful attempt to give poetical treatment to contemporary subjects. It is also helpful to notice that the narrator is self-consciously aware of the predisposition of embellishment. In Book 2, for example, Aurora interrupts a descriptive passage to explain, why so indeed I'm writing like a poet, somewhat large in a type of the imaginative and exaggerate, a small thing with a great thing toppling it. There is also narratorial self-consciousness in Aurora Leigh concerning the poem's forms. Henry James was not alone in the thinking of Barrett Browning's sense of the poetic form was an absolute muddle. It was presumably to preempt herself what form is best for poems. The answer is to trust the spirit, to make the form inward evermore, to outward. Prima facie, this might seem an unsatisfactory rationale for solving the formal and compositional problems presented in the book-length narrative poem. Consider, for example, the insufficient attention given to the difficulties of accommodating two generally different elements, the first-person retrospective account of inner development and the representation of modern life held together by a love plot. The mixture of these elements leads to confusing switches between the retrospective and the present tense narration, and to a blurring of the distinction between the narrating self and the experiencing self. In the first four books, the principal subject is Aurora's artistic development, and the narration is clearly retrospective. Beginning with book 5, however, the principal subject is the search for emotional fulfillment and the attainment of its prerequisite, self-knowledge. Here, the mode of narration changes from authoritative retrospection to an immersion in events that presupposes no distance between character and narrator. On the other hand, most readers of Aurora Leigh have been unaware of this discontinuity, and only one reviewer and two recent commentators have seemed to have noticed it. This is surely because Aurora Leigh, as both character and narrator, is her same loquacious self throughout the poem, and is both the first 4 and the last 5 books is equally preoccupied with her own inner experience. This is to say, her subjectivity is predominant throughout the poem. In the early Victorian period, the question of subjectivity of poetic subject matter was as pressing as that of the relationship of poetry to contemporary life. In the 1830s, Carlyle, Browning, and Tennyson had all felt impelled to announce a renunciation of subjectivity. Close thy Byron, open thy Goethe was the imperative encapsulation of the spiritual progression of the central character of Carlyle's Sataris Artis. I'll look within no more, announced the public speaker of Pauline, Browning's first published poem, and the sole figure of Tennyson's Palace at Art eventually comes to quit her enclosed art world and seek out a cottage in the Vale, though she says she may one day return to the palace with others when she has purged herself of the guilt of self-absorption. In her 1853 preface, Arnold not only excoriated the view that the poet should take his subjects from contemporary life, but also anesthetized the claim that a true allegory is a state of one man's control in a representative history is perhaps the highest thing that one can attempt in the way of poetry. The eternal object of poetry is rather those human actions that perennially appeal to the great primary human affection. It might be thought that the Victorian poems in contemporary life would be evidence of the decline of subjectivity as materia poetica, but this is by no means the case. Tennyson's Lockley Hall and Maud's Clouds, Amours de Voyage, Meredith's Modern Love, and Aurora Leigh, all these poems of contemporary life find their focal point and center of interest in the intense and frequently incapacitating self-consciousness of the central character. This distinctive mixture of subject and objective of mid-century poetry was cited by W.L. Roscoe as the reason for an opportunity of the narrative poems of George Crabbe, the last great poet who made man and his lives of men the direct subject of his verse in modern poetry. We were going to leave this here for tomorrow for another day. I still want to talk about Poe's trip on what he's doing to merit Elizabeth Barrett. We're just going to read a little bit of Poe has to say about this, because I don't get it. What's going on? I think the English are stuck up. That's just my personal opinion. Elizabeth Barrett, a well-bred man, says Sir James Puckle, in his gray cap for a green head, will never give himself the liberty to speak ill of women. We emphasize the man, setting aside for the present certain rare commentators and compilers of the species, creatures nearly precisely men, women, nor merry Wallenstone crafts. Setting these aside as unclassifiable, we may observe that the races of critics are masculine men, with the exception perhaps of Miss Anne Royal. We can call to mind no female who has occupied, even temporarily, the Zolius throne. And this, the Celtic law, is an evil with the inherent chivalry of the critical man, renders it not only an unpleasant task to him to speak ill of a woman, and a woman and her book are identical, and an almost impossible task not to laud her ad nauseum. In general, therefore, it is the unhappy lot of the authoress to be subjected time after time to the downright degradation of mere puffery. In her own aside of the Atlantic, Miss Barrett has indeed, in one instance at least, escaped the infliction of this lamentable contumely and wrong, but as if she has been readily salacious and its infliction in America, she could not have adopted a more effectual plan than that of saying a few words about the great American people in an American edition of her work, published under the superintendence of an American author, of the innumerable native notices of the drama of exile, which have come under our observation. Can we call to mind no one in which there is anything more remarkable than the critic's dogged determination to find nothing barren from Bathsheba to Dan? Another in the dramatic review has proceeded so far, it is true, as to venture a very delicate insinuation to the effect that the poetess will not fail to speak her mind, though it brings upon her a bad rhyme. Beyond this, nobody has proceeded, and as for the elaborate paper of the New Whig Monthly, all that anybody can say or think, and that all that Miss Barrett can feel representing it is that it is a eulogy as well written as it is an insult well intended. Now, to all the friends of the fair author, we doubt whether one exists with more profound, with more enthusiastic reverence and admiration of her genius than the writer of these words, and it is for this very reason, beyond all others, that he intends to speak of her the truth. Our chief regret is nevertheless that the limits of this work will preclude the possibility of our speaking this truth so fully and so much in detail as we could wish. But far the most valuable criticism that we or that anyone could give of the volumes now lying before us would be the quotation of 3/4 of their contents. But we have this advantage that the work has been long published and almost universally read, and thus in some measure we may proceed consciously as the text of our context were an understood thing. In the preface of this, the American edition of her late poems, Miss Barrett, speaking of the drama of exile, says, I've decided to publish it after considerable hesitation and doubt. Its subject matter fastened on me, then was chosen, and the form approaching the model of the Greek tragedy shaped itself under my hand rather by force of pleasure than by design. Of when the compositional excitement had subsided, I felt afraid of my position. My own object was the draw and strange experience of the fallen humanity as it went forth from paradise in the wilderness, with a peculiar reference to Eve's allotted grief, which, considering that self-sacrifice belonged to her womanhood, and the consciousness of the being, the origin of the fall to her absence, appeared in me imperfectly apprehended hitherto, and me inexpressible by a woman than by a man. In this abstract announcement of the theme, it is difficult to understand the ground of the poet's hesitation to publish, for the theme in itself seems admirably adapted to the purposes of the closest drama. The poet, nevertheless, is very properly conscious of failure, a failure which occurs not in the general, but in the particular conception, and which must be placed on the account of the model of the Greek tragedies. The Greek tragedies have and even have high merits, and we act wisely, but now substituting for the external and typified human sympathy of the antique chorus a direct, internal, living, and moving sympathy itself. And although Achilles might have done service as a model to either Euripides or Sophocles, yet were Sophocles and Euripides in London today, they would perhaps, while granting a certain formless and shadowy grandeur, indulge in a quiet smile of the shallowness and uncouthness of that art which in the old amphitheaters had beguiled them into the applause of the Oedipus of Colonos. Would have been better for Miss Barrett if, throwing herself independently upon her own very extraordinary resources and forgetting that a Greek has ever lived and she had evolved her Eve on the series of adventures merely natural, or if not this, of adventures preternatural within the limits of at least a conceivable relation, a relation of matter to spirit and spirit to matter, that should have left room for something like palatable action and the comprehensible emotion, that should not have utterly precluded the development of the womanly character which is admitted as the principal object of the poem. As the case actually stands, it is only the few snatches of verbal intercommunication with Adam and Lucifer that we behold as her as a woman at all. As for the rest, she is a mystical something or nothing, and wrapped in a fog of rhapsody about the transfiguration of the seed and the bruising of the heel, and the other talk of the nature that no man ever pretended to understand in the plain prose in which even Solar microscoped into poetry upon the model of the Greek drama, and about as convincing as the Egyptian lectures of Mr. Stilk and Buckingham, about as much as any purpose under the sun as the high priesthood conjurations of Signor Blitz. What are to we make, for example, of dramatic colloquy such as this? The words are those of a chorus of invisible angels addressing Adam. Live, work on, O earthy, by thy actual's tension. Speed the arrow worthy of thy pure ascension. From the low earth round you, reach the heights above you. From the stripes that wound you, seeks the love that love you. God's divine is pureth plain through the crystal diphane of our loves that love you. Now we do not mean to assert that by expressive tension of the intellect a reader accustomed to the cant of the transcendentalists, or of those degrade and ennobling philosophy by styling themselves such, may not succeed in ferreting from the passages quoted, and indeed from each essential of the thousand similar ones throughout the book, something that shall bear the aspect of the absolute idea, that we do not mean to say first that in 9 cases out of 10 the thought when dug out will be found very poorly to repay the labor of the digging, for it is the nature of thought in general, as it is the nature of some ogres in particular, to be richest when most superficial. And we do mean to say, secondly, that in 19 cases out of 20, the reader will suffer the most valuable horror to remain unminded to all eternity before he will be put to the trouble of digging for it 1 inch. And we do mean to assertedly, thirdly, but not reader is to be condemned for not putting himself to the trouble of digging even 1 inch, for no writer has the right to impose any such necessity upon him. What is worthy thinking is distinctly thought. What is distinctly thought can and should be distinctly expressed, or should not be expressed at all. Nevertheless, there is no more appropriate opportunity than the present for admitting and maintaining at once that has never before been either maintained or admitted, that there is a justifiable exception for the rule, for which we contend it is there that we design is to convey the fantastic, not the obscure. To give the idea of the latter, we need it as in general the most precise and definite terms, and those who employ other terms but confound obscurity of expression and the expression of obscurity. The fantastic in itself, however, phantasm, may be materially referred in its development by the quaint phraseology, a proposition which any moralist may examine in his leisure for himself. The drama of exile opens for a very palatable bull, seeing the outer side of the gate of Eden, shut fast with clouds, as seen out of sight, from the death of which revolves a sword of fire, self-moved, a watch of innumerable angels, rank above rank, slopes above from around it to the zenith, and the glare cast from the brightness and from the sword extends many miles into the wilderness. Adam and Eve are seen in the distance flying along the glare. The angel Gabriel and Lucifer are besides the gate. These are the stage directions which greet us on the threshold of the book. We complain first to the bull, secondly of the blue fire melodramatic aspect of the revolving sword, thirdly of the duplicate nature of the sword, which if steel and sufficiently inflamed to do service in burning would perhaps have been in no temper to cut, and on the other hand, if sufficiently cool to have an edge, would have accomplished little in the way of scorching a personage so well accustomed to fire and brimstone. That all that, and we have very good reason to believe Lucifer was. We cannot help objecting to the innumerable angels as a force altogether disproportioned to the one enemy to be kept out, either the self-moving sword itself, we think, or the angel Gabriel alone, or 5 or 6 of the innumerable angels would have sufficed to keep the devil, as is it Adam, outside the gate, which after all he might not have been able to discover on account of the clouds. Far be it from us, however, to dwell inadvertently on the matters which have venerability in the faith or in the fancy of Miss Barrett. We allude to these nicest series, as we have found here in the very first paragraph of her poem, simply by way of putting on the cleverest light the mass of inconsistency and antagonism in which her subject has inexplicably involved her. She has made allusion to Milton and no doubt felt secure in her theme, that is, theme merely, and that she considered his Paradise Lost. But even in Milton's own day, when man was the habit of believing all things, the nonsensical, the more readily, and the worshiping of blind acquiescence, and the most preposterous of impossibilities, then even there was not wanting individuals who would have read the great epic with more zest, could have been explained to their satisfaction how and why it was not only that a snake quoted Aristotle's Ethics and behaved otherwise pretty much as he pleased, but that bloody battles were continually being fought between bloodless and innumerable angels that found no convenience in losing a wig one minute and the head the next, and pointed up to a puff paste late in the afternoon, whereas good innumerable angels as new the next morning in time to be the reval roll call. And now at the present epoch, there are few people who do not occasionally think that it is emphatically the thinking age. Indeed, it may well be questioned whether mankind ever substantially thought before. The fact is that Paradise Lost was written today, assuming that it had never been written when it was, and even its eminent, although overestimated merits would counterbalance either the public view or the opinion of any critic, at once intelligent and honest, the multitudinous incongruities which are part and parcel of its plot. In the plot of the drama of Miss Barrett, it is something even worse than incongruity, which affronts a continuous mystical strain of ill-filting and ill-aggregated allegory. If indeed allegory is not much too respectable a term for it, we are called upon, for example, to sympathize in the whimsical woes of two spirits who unspringingly from the bowels of the earth and said immediately to bewailing the miseries in jargon such as this: I am the spirit of the harmless earth. God spake me softly out among the stars, as softly as a blessing of much worth, and then his smile did follow unawares, that all things fashioned so for use and duty might shine anointed with his chrism of beauty. Yet I wail, I drave on this with the world's excludingly, obliquely down the godlight's gradual fall, individual aspect and complexity of gyratory orb and interval, lost in the fluent motion of delight toward the high ends of beyond sight. Yet I wail. Innumerable other spirits discourse successfully after the same fashion, each ending every stanza at his lamentation with the yet I wail. And when length they have fairly made an end, it's always coming to do the trash when I'm reading, but when at length they have fairly made an end, Eve touches Adam upon the elbow and hazards also the profound and pathetic observation, Lo, Adam, they wail, which is nothing more than the simplest truth, for they do, and God delivers us from any such wailing again. It is not our purpose, however, to demonstrate that every reader of these volumes will have readily seen self-demonstrated the utter indefensibility of the drama of exile. Considered uniquely as a work of art, we have none of us to be told that a melody of metaphysical recitatives sung out of tune at Adam and Eve by all manners of inconceivable abstractions is not exactly the best material for the poem. Still, it may very well happen that among this material there shall be individual passages of great beauty, but should anyone doubt the possibility, let him be satisfied by a single extract such as follows: on a mountain peak, half sheathed in primal woods and glittering in spasms of awful sunshine at that hour, a lion crouched, part raised upon his paws, with his calm, massive face turned full on thine, and his mane listening, and the endured curse left silence in the world. Right suddenly he sprang up rampant, and stood straight and stiff, and if the new reality of death were dashed against disease, and roared so fierce, such thick carnivorous passion in his throat, tearing a passage through the wrath and fear, and roared so wild and smote from all the hills, such fast keen echoes crumbling down the vales to distant silence, that the forest beasts, and after one did muster a response in savage and in sorrowful complaint, which trailed along the gorges. Here, there is a Homeric force here, a vivid picturesqueness which all men will appreciate and admire. It is, however, the longest quotable passage in the drama. I think we will leave it here, where he says, here is a heroic force here, a vivid picturesqueness, which all men will appreciate and admire. Oh, here's Poe admiring Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He's admiring her as he shits all over her. So we're just going to leave it for another day. And these are not in my opinions. I'm just reading the words of other artists and poets. So there's no liability on my part. Please like and enjoy and have a nice day.